My name is Ryan Hervey. I'm an advisor in our West Des Moines office. And before I entered this world, I worked in the estate planning world. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart and something that I hope we can provide some, maybe some depth to your knowledge of trusts. And that's really what we're going to focus on today is the use of trusts, their differences. There's a lot of misunderstandings about them, but that's what we're going to aim at. These are our regular disclosures. I work only on the RIA side, so my advisory services are offered through Excel Wealth Management. Some of my colleagues have different licensing as well. So if you have more questions about those, we'd be happy to answer them. So I'm going to let you go ahead and share our poll, Julie. Mm-hmm. Quick poll before we get started here. When were trusts invented? All right, I think we've reached our full participation. I kind of wanted to put this in here this week just because my kids are taking guy with test of basic skills or whatever they call it these days. So trusts were invented technically at the beginning of the 200 BC. So in Rome allowed a structure that started as a moral law and then became a legally enforceable law where you would leave property to someone using basically the Latin word for fiduciary, and that person would hold on to property, be its owner until it could be legally passed on to someone else. And so that is kind of the genesis of trusts. Then in England in 1215, the Magna Carta builds out more of a structure legally around how property is held and what ownership looks like. And all of our law basically kind of is derived from English law. So these are concepts that are thousands of years old, and they are still a huge part of what we do today. The Constitution didn't talk about them at all. So 1787 is not right. And neither there is a Reconstruction in the US. So those two were just thrown in there because they were important fun dates. But the roots of trust law date back a very long time. So if you were on our first estate planning presentation that I did a few months ago, we kind of went over healthcare powers of attorney, living wills, power of attorneys, last will and testament. And those were part of that. Today, we're going to focus on just testamentary trusts, revocable trusts, and irrevocable trusts. So first and foremost, I'm going to go to a screen after this. It's going to talk about the creation, and that's going to make this part make sense. So you don't need to try to memorize this, but revocable trusts and irrevocable trusts become effective during your life. A testamentary trust is created in a different way, and so there's a different effect on it. All three types are effective after your death. Where a power of attorney document stops the minute you die, trust can go on into a very long time. You know, in Rome, they use this to control property for hundreds and hundreds of years. It would become part of the English system of aristocracy in controlling property for hundreds and hundreds of years. So a trust is really designed for ongoing after death planning. Revocable trusts and irrevocable trusts are both private documents. Those are not publicly admitted. The trustee is the power holder in all three. They are the legal owner of property that's owned by a trust. I'm going to break that down a little bit more as we go. And then for purpose, again, testamentary trust is just for administration of assets after probate gets completed. Revocable trusts are for managing assets in life and in death. And irrevocable trusts are used to remove assets from the estate for either income tax purposes or estate tax purposes or both. So to understand trust the best, this is really a creation story. So we talked about why Rome did it, why England did it. Today, even the way we make our trust impacts the way that it behaves. So in our columns, we have the testamentary trust. And that is a trust that gets created by your will. So it's not something in existence until you die. And even at your death, it is not created. It is created once your will goes into probate. And the probate court itself starts that trust. And the reason is it's got its roots in what probate court does. Probate court exists for the orderly transition of property. And so because if we're talking about me and I have a will that creates a testamentary trust, when I die, I own my property. And so in order for it to get to that trust, the probate court will create that trust under the will. That's the authority. And then my assets have to transfer from my name into my trust. That process is occurring in the probate court. So you are going to pay a fee for any assets that end up being transferred from there. In general, I would say that you can usually plan for about 5% as like a rule of thumb cost for probate. So if you look at the total number of your assets that would pass through probate, 5% of that's going to end up being fees. And that's usually 2 in court, 2 in lawyers, and then 1 that kind of gets spread out through some administrative type of things. So this process is the least cost effective, and it is it's the most well known because your will is also a public document. And because your trust exists inside of your will, technically your trust is now a public document as well because it's embedded in that will. And as such, it's a fit for certain circumstances. We're going to go through that later, but it's not necessarily the best fit for everybody. The second type of trust is a revocable trust. You can see I've underlined the revoke part of that. You have the ability when you create a revocable trust to pull it back, amend it, change it anytime you want. So you still have a ton of flexibility while you're alive to make changes to that thing. If things change, your favorite kid is no longer your favorite kid. Your favorite grandchild is no longer your favorite grandchild. To the point of, maybe someone died, maybe someone's going through a divorce. You have all of those kind of things that can affect the way planning needs to be done. A revocable trust is extremely flexible in creating those opportunities. What allows a revocable trust to avoid the probate process is when we sign a trust into being, we will then immediately turn and add property to that trust. So the house that I used to own in my own name would now be owned by my revocable trust. That transaction generally isn't going to trigger, an acceleration of your mortgage. It's something that banks are super used to doing. Brokerage accounts are easily changed. There's a process for doing this that doesn't trigger a bunch of negative side effects, but it's something that has to be done. Because if we don't get things moved into that revocable trust, the issue we have is it will still have to pass through probate. And so getting the work cleaned up after the fact is a really critical part of revocable trust creation. But then once that trust owns it, your trustee is going to follow the rules of the trust and pass property according to what those rules are. There are legally enforceable rights that exist within that. There's all sorts of good stuff that exists within the trust. But if the property doesn't get added, the way you'll hear this sometimes phrased is the trust is funded. So the funding of the trust means it owns things and it has power over those things. The other thing that does is in periods of maybe crisis in someone's life, generally a trustee is going to have more power than a power of attorney. So where a power of attorney is taking something that's in my name, my power of attorney is going to act on my behalf. Where in a trustee, if a trustee is going to do something, they're doing it as the actual owner of property. So if I'm my own trustee, I have a health crisis, it goes to my successor trustee, they're not acting on my behalf anymore. they are the owner of property within that trust. And so they have all the rights that an owner has. That's a huge difference between what a power of attorney does for property and what a trustee has for control of a property. And then lastly, we've got the irrevocable trust. There are some exceptions. So I don't want to say that it's 100% irrevocable all the time. There are some ways to modify trusts. I will tell you that if you do an irrevocable trust, that it's difficult to modify. It could be impossible to modify depending on circumstances. And it is something that would be extremely cost ineffective to have to make changes to. The good fortune is we're going to walk through who does irrevocable trusts. Not very many people really qualify to do them. It's not really necessary for most people. So I'm going to teach a little bit about them so that you have an idea and understanding of why they're different. But just know that they're the strong minority of trusts that get created. And the reason is that last bullet is they're an independent entity. So once that trust gets funded, those assets are gone. And so there's some clever trusts that have been created over the years. There's a spousal lifetime access trust. There's intentionally defective trusts, which obviously sound weird that they're intentionally defective. But those are designed to do very specific things in specific circumstances. So we're not going to necessarily dive into the depths of them, but usually it's for transferring large amounts of wealth that will implement those trusts. The other thing that's worth noting is that when I own a revocable trust and I die, my trust is no longer revocable. It is irrevocable at that point. So whatever is in place at my death, those are the rules that are going to be followed by my trustee. So I've kind of gone through a little bit of this, but I love to be visual just so that, you know, if you missed it, if I threw too many words at it, you can see it. So amendable during life. Yes, you can always amend your will. As long as you're alive, your testamentary trust has not been created yet. On the revocable trust side, completely revocable, amendable. We can make small changes, which would be like an addendum. Sometimes if you just want to change, you know, I've decided that my kids don't get my property until, you know, they get some at 30, some at 35, and some at 40. And then my kids are 28 and 26, and I'm looking at them like they're still idiots. I can go back in and amend that so that my kids get their property at 40, 45, and 50, and hope that in the next 10 years they develop some maturity. That's something that you can do in a revocable trust. Things that made sense when you did it, sometimes 5 to 10 years later, don't make as much sense. And so you can go in, you can clean it up, make that happen. For long-term control of assets. So this is going to be something I want to hold in place. I want my trust to pay income to my kids for their life. But I don't want them to get principal, or I want them to get some principal, but not all the principal of that trust. And then I want that to go to my grandkids. Or I want income from my kids and my grandkids, because I think they're all going to get spoiled by getting a big chunk of money. Depending on your state, you can hold that, you know, for maybe 100 years of just having income production. That control feature exists in all three types of trusts. So trust can theoretically go on forever and ever and ever. It's the states themselves that limit how long trust can control property. It's very American to not want our property to be held by one family forever and ever and ever. That's part of the reason Americans came to America from England was because of that structure. So most states tend to limit it. There are some states that don't. Those generally get called dynasty trusts in those states. South Dakota is a state that has dynasty trusts, that I have clients that have trusts there. And those are, their trusts in particular are designed to hold property and pay income for 6 generations before they pay out to the 7th generation. So that's something that wouldn't be available in Iowa that is available in South Dakota. And so there's rules around how you get assets into it, but trust can control things for a very long time. The reminder that by comparison, that if I just have a will and it doesn't create a testamentary trust, my property needs to be transferred to its new owner within 9 months in most states. So, about the time that it takes to create a baby from soup to nuts, it's that time period. I have to have this trust or this estate done. All the property needs to be transferred and it's now fully in someone else's hands. Within that, I have this third type of trust is a special needs trust. So I'm not going to go over it as an independent trust because almost always, not almost always, frequently, special needs trusts exist within one of these types of trust. And that special needs trust is a specially designed trust that allows for people that are receiving government or private income-based assistance for their needs to be able to receive assets from a trust. They can receive care from this trust without disqualifying them for other available services. That special needs trust is something that's really cool. So when I was in private practice, we had a child that was left a special needs trust. The child was autistic and used a ton of art therapy. The child also had it was functioning at a level where they could travel. And so the trust allowed, after parents were gone, for this adult child to travel with a chaperone to France to go to the Louvre. And so that is a thing where there's no cash changing hands. The trust can't give the special needs individual access to cash because that would disqualify them from a lot of the programs that exist. But it did allow for them to have this different experience. And that's something that like a parent would normally want to provide for their child. Parents gone, the trust steps in and is able to do this thing. So it's special needs trusts. If you know someone who is in a position where they're disabled in some form, they're using some type of government assistance or private income-based assistance, there's a type of trust that's designed to serve that purpose alone. And any one of these three types of trust can create that subtrust. Can provide for advanced estate tax planning. All three of the trusts that we're looking at can do that as well. And so advanced estate tax planning it's not quite as big an issue right now because we can transfer tens of millions of dollars without creating an inheritance tax issue at a federal level. Each state has their own set of rules that can be different. But these types of trusts are more complex. They divide property out to take advantage of tax laws and the way they're written. Any one of these three can have that structure built out inside of them. So sometimes you'll see this, that someone will have a revocable trust. And then when they die, they've got money that goes into a marital trust. And then they've got money that goes into a family trust. And there's two different tax events that occur when those two transfers occur. Generally, someone that's going to start considering advanced estate tax planning is going to be someone with about $10 million in assets that would be in their overall estate. At that point, it's probably worth the conversation. If tax law changes in the future, that estate tax threshold has been much, much lower historically. So there was a time in my career, and I've been out of law school for 21 years. When I got out of law school, you could only transfer $1 million each. So the fact that we can now transfer tens of millions of dollars without triggering a tax event is a big deal. But this is something that's always, it's an easy target because it's not tied to the income tax. It's its own system, and it's easy to be portrayed as, as the rich person's tax. So we can target that and make changes. The cynical side of me said there's not many changes coming because a lot of politicians have now generated very large estates as well, and they don't want to be taxed on it. So I don't know that we're ever going to have a full rollback to those really low numbers, but it's certainly something that fluctuates depending on the tax regime. So while we've done some of this really future planning, only one of these three trusts are going to have an impact on your income tax. So the reason is when you're doing a testamentary trust, again, it doesn't exist. So I'm just living my life normally, filing my own tax return. I make my own money. I own my own stuff. A revocable trust is typically going to have your social security number as its EIN number or its taxpayer identification number. Because of that, when you go to file your taxes, it's as if the revocable trust doesn't exist. From a tax form perspective, when you get your interest statement on your mortgage, that's going to come it's going to come to you, and it's going to be in your social security number, and it's going to be part of your income tax issues. Brokerage accounts, same way. The revocable trust is completely pass through for income tax purposes. The irrevocable trust is different in this regard. So when we do the irrevocable trust, and I've now transferred an asset to it, that income typically can't come back to me. There are some exceptions. Again, I told you there's a bunch of different irrevocable trusts that have this very limited scope designed to do very specific things. But even in doing so, because that asset's out of my control, it's no longer mine, it's going to an independent entity, it's going to cause some tax differences on my annual income tax returns. So sometimes that means the income's gone, you don't have to worry about it anymore. Or if it's coming back, then it may be treated differently than if you just made it and reported it, because it's coming through this trust entity that stands alone from you. So we tend to do these kind of trusts when we have really large asset bases. That's why you do an irrevocable trust, trying to take advantage of tax law, pass it to a trust for the next generation early. But typically that income's not going to flow back to you when you make that change. So again, very limited group of people that end up using most irrevocable trusts. The one exception to that would be life insurance. So when you die, your life insurance is part of your taxable estate. So it avoids probate if we've named a beneficiary that's different than our estate. If we name our estate, it does flow through probate. But if I've named a person, life insurance is going to go directly to them. But that death benefit amount will be in your taxable estate. So where that mattered is when you could only pass 2 million without a tax consequence, and I own $10 million of farmland. Well, when I die and there's this bill that gets figured at maybe 40%, depending on what year that was, 40% on $8 million is a significant chunk of money. And most people with $10 million in farmland don't have that kind of cash sitting around. So you would have the choice. You could either sell it, you could leverage it by going to a bank and getting a loan for it, or you could own a life insurance product that would pay a death benefit to create liquidity to pay that bill. But the problem is if I own that life insurance in my estate, and it's we'll say it's a $3 million policy, that $3 million gets added to my 10 million. So I'm getting taxed on 40% on that extra $3 million. So we would use something called a life insurance irrevocable trust. So an ILIT is what these are actually called, irrevocable life insurance trust. And I would just gift the premiums to that trust. It would own the life insurance so that when I died, that life insurance is income tax free, goes into that trust, and it is now liquid and not part of my estate. So it can funnel some cash back in order to pay that tax bill. So it is still pretty common to run into irrevocable life insurance trusts. Once you've set them up, there's really not a reason to break them down. It's an easy way to effectively move money from a wealth perspective in a very tax efficient way. So if you bump into one of those, you hear about that, there's a generation in your family that has it, those kind of things. That is an irrevocable trust. And so the only way that I can really stop my kids from getting that life insurance policy, if it's my trust, is to stop funding it, make it fail. Otherwise, I can't go in and change who the beneficiaries of that are. Before I dive into the examples, do we have any questions, Julie, that are out there that maybe I should hit before we get deeper?
Not at this time.
Okay, perfect. So common use, and this is, I think, where you start to look for yourself or look for your family and some of these trust examples. Testamentary trust is commonly used with younger parents. So, you maybe haven't been married very long. You're probably not flush with cash quite yet. Testamentary trusts are cheaper to do because it's just a will. You charge, attorneys charge less for a will with a trust in it. Your will is going to name the guardians for your kids. So if you die before they're of age, that will is going to name that. The trust is going to get created to provide financial structure for them so that they can receive income. You can put some really strict rules over what distributions can look like by your trustee, or you can give your trustee a lot of discretion. The power of the trust here comes from the fact that I'll get people that'll ask me, hey, can I just name my sister as a beneficiary of all of my things, and she'll take care of my kids. That's who I'm naming as guardian. So can't she just do it? In theory, yes. But if there's a falling out between your kids and your sister as they're teenagers, and I know teenagers can be mouthy at times, your sister, it's her property then. You've left it to her. So even though she may have a moral obligation to you, she does not have a legal one. And so if she gets a divorce, in theory, those assets are going to be part of her divorce proceedings. If she dies, they're going to be a part of her estate proceedings. So the trust allows that thing to stand alone. Because if you recall, when you die, your trust becomes irrevocable. So it's now its own independent entity. It files its own tax return. It has its own taxpayer ID number. So that carves it out. So it's not part of your sister's estate. Even if she's the trustee, she's acting as the fiduciary for the trust. So it's not going to be affected by what happens in her life. It is a massive distinction in the law, and it is a no-brainer for anyone that's leaving property to minor children. Again, that distribution rules around it. There's a thing called HEMS, which is very common. If you go through this estate planning process, you may hear the phrase HEMS. And that means that principal can be distributed for your health, education, maintenance, and support. That's the HEMS that make up the phrase HEMS. And so if I am the trustee for nieces and nephews, one of them comes to me and says, I want to go to Harvard. If the trust has the money in order to pay the tuition to go to Harvard, education's a place where I can draw principal to pay for that. Kid comes to me and says, I absolutely need a Lamborghini. That is not going to be something that's going to be part of maintenance and support. It doesn't help their education, and it's not part of it. It's probably a bad factor for their health. So that's something where I'm not going to distribute money as a trustee, and they're not going to have a legal right to enforce it. So HIMS becomes the most common language. It's not required. It's not built in to every trust, but it is the most common level of rule base that we put in a trust. The revocable trust starts to apply better to people that are nearing retirement that aren't going to be moving around as much, largely because the paperwork things that you have to do in order for a trust to function properly. So that's a couple that's, doesn't have a lot of transactions. They're not buying and adding properties. They're not moving around a lot. They transfer the house they live in to a revocable trust. As they age, that gives their trustee better power, whether that's a kid, whether that's someone else that, to come alongside if we start to have dementia enter the equation. There's a lot of ways where that revocable trust, the power it gives, allows for a kind of an easier aging process. If you have enough value in your assets, kind of once you hit $250,000, revocable trusts are worth it from there on out. You're going to save money, even though you pay a little bit more upfront. The cost of probate fees are going to be reduced dramatically. The cost of estate administration and the ease of estate administration improve. So that would be a reason to have a revocable trust. If you own properties in multiple states, that's another reason to have a revocable trust. The reason being, if I own a home in Iowa and I have a cabin in Wisconsin and I die with those in my name, there has to be a probate estate opened in each one of those two states. So if you want a headache, that's a great way to get one. So when I have a revocable trust, my revocable trust can own property in multiple states. One trust owns it all, like in the way that kind of a business does. And so now my trustee has the ability to move that property without having to go through probate, without having a judge supervising it. The trust also allows us to limit distributions to kids, designs plans for grandkids, and it can keep it all private so that not everyone knows what happened. If your trustee is independent from your family, there's no way your family's ever going to know that some kids got more than other kids or some grandkids got more than other kids unless they tell each other. And even then, it's, do you believe them or not? And then lastly, irrevocable trusts are really focused on people that are asset rich or in cash limited. So we're trying to move some cash away or move some assets away. We don't have to worry about what the effects of those are. Doctors do it as well. Some lawyers do it. People that would be exposed to large liability for certain things will sometimes use irrevocable trusts. And there's just because we're playing games with how to protect things from liability. That's not a value judgment on whether it should or shouldn't happen. It's just that's the group of people that are using irrevocable trusts. We do use it for the life insurance, like we discussed earlier, and then it becomes a gifting process of giving things to that trust in order to finance the way that thing's supposed to function. Okay, 3 trusts, 3 different targets of who ends up using them. Any questions with any of that?
We had one that came up. It says, what was the dollar amount for the revocable trust?
I think a good rule of thumb is if your estate's going to be 200 to 250,000 or more, I think it becomes kind of a no-brainer to have a revocable trust. And basically what you can do is just do the math on 5% of your assets. If you think a revocable trust may, depending on where you're at and how complex you make it, is probably going to be $1,500 to $2,000 for that whole estate planning to come into place. So at whatever point 5% of your estate is more than that, it's cost effective. The larger an estate gets, so if you've got, retirement accounts are hard because typically we don't necessarily leave them to trusts because of the taxation. If it's a traditional account, it hasn't been taxed yet. There's some rules around that, being able to stretch it and move things around in an IRA. So that's a kind of a different thing. But if your house is worth more than $250,000, a revocable trust makes sense. If you have kids that are going to disagree with each other, then court makes sense, and having probate watch over it, unless you have a referee that you can name as a trustee that's going to be able to manage that situation. That then moves it back to the revocable side. I am the trustee if these certain trusts ever come into place for nieces and nephews of mine. And that's because I'm independent from it. And so they're not going to argue with each other. They get to be mad at me. And that's by design of nominating someone into that role that can take the heat.
Got one more, Ryan. It says, how much does it cost to make changes to a revocable trust?
It kind of depends on what the the change is going to be, but most attorneys are going to do that hourly as opposed to you usually buy, in most cases, a kind of a trust package. They can kind of estimate it's going to cost $2,000 to get your revocable trust, your pour over will, but your pour over will is just a will that says if I missed anything, it needs to go into my trust. However, that will still goes through probate. So it's not the best way. It's just a safety net to make sure that the rules of the trust apply to assets. But any of those assets that get missed and get caught by the pour over will still have probate costs. So, and then part of that package is usually financial power of attorney, and that would be for doing daily bills kind of stuff on things your trust doesn't own, and then a healthcare power of attorney, living will type of thing. That's usually involved in the whole package. From there, if I go in and I need to change beneficiaries, or someone's died, or someone's divorced, or someone's had, mental health issues, and now we can't leave them a lump sum, those changes are usually going to be hourly. I would guess that most attorneys would probably, for fairly simple stuff, are going to quote you an hour or two. And anything beyond that, if we're kind of rewriting the whole trust, then you're probably going to start stretching into that $1,000 to $2,000 range, depending on how much time they're spending to get you there.
One more. This is a good one because it does happen more frequent. It says, what happens with an existing trust if a divorce happens?
If the question asker could give me a more specific on who got divorced, I would be happy to be more targeted with my answer. Otherwise, I can spread it out across all the different scenarios.
Just in general.
Okay, so if it's my trust and I get divorced, I probably need to get, depending on the state, there's some state level rules about this, but I need to go and I need to amend it and make all the changes, just to make sure that things happen the way that I want it to. If I've left things to my kids in a trust, typically part of your consultative process is an attorney will ask. We talk about this with our clients before we ever get the attorney involved, but do you want your daughter-in-law to get something, or do you want this to stay in your line? And if you think back to Rome, you think back to England, those things were actually built on keeping things in a certain line. And so we still have that power in a trust document. So I could leave something to my kids and exclude their spouse, and then it goes to, my future grandkids after my child, so that you don't have things that end up in hands that you don't intend for. You can also, with a trust documents can be altered all over the place. So when you go to a lawyer, they're going to try to give you one that's as close to their base boilerplate document as possible. But if you have specific things that you care about, and again, this is something that we talk to our clients about because we want them to have the estate plan they want to have, is maybe I want to provide specific things that happen if any of my children get divorced. And maybe it's, I like my children-in-law and I know that my child is a huge problem. And maybe I want them to be, compensated through that process. I can design it to do that. That's not the default setting, but I can go in and say, to my daughter-in-law, you managed to deal with my son for this long. You should at least get some chunk of money for doing so. You can build that into the document as well. And in some cases, you can actually change the ramifications for your own kid if they get divorced. So there's a lot of different things in there. So we use age restrictions. When I talk about my kids getting things at 30, 35, and 40, it may mean because they got divorced after age 30, some of this money got included in their divorce proceeding and their spouse walked away with a chunk of it as well. Well, they're still got a payment coming when they're 35 and another payment when they're 40. So they didn't lose it all. And that's why I'm a big fan of kind of breaking up when distributions occur, because life, goes crazy. I mean, we look at the screen for next month's presentation. Life happens and divorce happens. And in doing so, we just want the trust to reflect your thoughts on future divorces in your line.
Great job. Very good questions. Keep them coming if you have them. Last one. Do you set up trust and wills, Brian?
We do not. So what we do in Des Moines with our clients is we sit down with them and talk about what do you want to have happen? So in a perfect world, how big can you dream for what you want to have happen with kids, grandkids, nieces and nephews, any of those kind of things. And if you don't have a niece or nephew, I definitely suggest a trust, because that can be a very chaotic situation if you just use a will. So if we're gonna do that, we're going to talk about what do you want to have happen? What would you have done in those situations? What are your concerns about the future generation? Is it divorce? Is it drugs? Is it addiction to gambling? Are there things that would cause us to need to tie up money? And we kind of walk through that. We whiteboard it. There tends to be a lot of laughter and some tears that come with this process as you have to think about grief. You have to think about kids that may react badly when you're gone. And we end up getting to joke about the kids that are going to do just fine a lot of times. So we go through that process, we design it, and then because we've thought things through, then we bring the attorney in to create the vision for what we've designed. And that process then reduces how much time the attorney's spending on it. And that assures that you're not just getting a boilerplate document. You're getting something that's been thought through and customized for what your goals are. At the end of the day, your goals may be just to get the money to your kids when they're 30 years old, split it in half and let them go. And if they screw it up, they screw it up. That's their problem, not a problem. In other cases, I may have a special needs child. I may have one that's irresponsible with money, and I may have two that are golden. Those four kids may need different things to occur. And we need to think through what each of them needs in order to have the best outcomes for them. And that's where that trust planning, we would rather do that with clients than have them have to do that with lawyers who are not incentivized to be creative. Because if they have to get real creative with you, typically they can't bill you for all that time, or just generally don't choose to. And so it's not profitable. So we try to make it profitable for the attorneys we work with. We want them to make their money, but we also want to limit how much that is, and it's not extra. And then we just build this thing out. So I would tell you that because you've sat through this, if you had a specific question about something in your life, I'm happy to answer those. If you're working with an advisor at Excel, I'm happy to bring them in on that conversation. We can have that conversation together so that things get done correctly. But that's something that we believe in is being creative and thinking big. But then we bring someone in to execute documents.
One more for you. It's a new one. It says, what happens to your revocable trust if you transition to a retirement community that provides care options throughout your life? Does it still provide income for your children, or will all your assets go to the retirement center?
Generally, your revocable trust is not going to get treated any different than if you owned those assets yourself. So if we are in a Medicaid situation where you need to spend down in order to qualify, you will burn through your revocable trust assets in the exact same way. So the only way to protect from that situation would be to do an irrevocable trust. So that's one of the reasons you would use an irrevocable trust, is because the government can't come and ask for income from that. However, you're subject to the 5 to 7 year look back, depending on where you live, for Medicaid purposes. So you have to anticipate that enough in the future to give those assets away 5 to 7 years before you need to go into some level of care facility. So while in theory, the irrevocable trust fits there, I don't see it happen very often in real life because it's hard to pull the trigger on it. And in doing so, like, you're now fully dependent on someone to take care of you for 5 years before you ever even get to the facility. So generally, I would not look at trusts as a way to solve that problem. Either you fund it through your own investments and savings. You look at doing some form of long-term care insurance product in order to help pay for that. Otherwise, you can plan on it's going to be pulling assets from you and or your revocable trust to pay for that care until it's gone, and then you qualify for state assistance. If there's more questions that pop up after this, I'm happy to answer them. I feel like trusts don't get explained well, and they get explained quickly a lot of times. So I tried to limit how much we talked about, and tried to keep it to some really core principles. But if there's specific questions you have, I'm happy to dive into those with you.
Next webinar is going to be on May 17th, and it's going to be Life Happens, and it's planning for every stage and surprise. So be looking out for those invites coming in your email box or our social media pages, and we will get you registered.
Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to talking again.
Thank you, everyone.